Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes. Today we're strapping in
Yeah.
for a wild ride through Michel Foucault's Discipline and Punish, The Birth of the Prison.
This book is a total mind bender. Foucault takes us on this journey through how punishment has changed in Western societies, from these crazy public torture spectacles to the more hidden systems of control we have today.
Okay.
And get this, it's not just about prisons. He's talking about how this discipline thing is woven into schools, hospitals, the military,
Right.
like everywhere.
So buckle up everyone because it sounds like we're going deep on this one.
Yeah.
What are the big juicy themes Foucault's tackling here?
Well, he starts by throwing us headfirst into this horrifying scene of public execution in the 1700s.
Okay.
But it's not just about the gore. He's showing us how punishment used to be this big public display of power, a way for the king to flex his authority and scare everyone straight.
Right.
But then things start to shift.
Here's where it gets really interesting. We move away from the chopping block and into the age of the prison.
Mhm.
It's like society traded in his axe for a scalpel, right?
Yeah.
It's still about control, but in a more refined, almost insidious way.
Exactly. And that's where the idea of discipline comes in. It's not just about locking people up.
Right.
It's about shaping them, making them behave in predictable ways.
Okay.
Think about school bells, military drills, factory time clocks. These are all tools of discipline, molding us into these docile bodies without us even realizing it.
Whoa. Okay, I'm starting to see how this all connects.
Yeah,
But let's go back to the beginning.
sure.
You mentioned a gruesome execution scene. Could you paint us a picture of that? I'm thinking our listener needs a little context here before we dive into the nitty-gritty.
Right, so picture the 1757 Paris. A guy named Robert-François Damiens is being executed for trying to kill the king. But this isn't just a quick death. Foucault describes in excruciating detail how they literally tear his flesh with hot pincers, pour molten lead on his wounds, and then draw and quarter him with horses. I mean, it's barbaric.
It's like something out of a horror movie.
Yeah.
I can see why Foucault chose to open the book with that.
It's meant to shock, for sure, but it also sets the stage for his whole argument. He's showing us how punishment used to be this spectacle, this ritual designed to instill fear and obedience. The condemned person's body was basically a prop in this elaborate performance of power.
Okay, so public torture, gruesome displays of power. Got it.
Mm-hmm.
But then how do we get from that to the modern prison system?
Right.
What sparked that shift?
Well, the Enlightenment was a big turning point. Thinkers started to question the brutality and effectiveness of all that public torture. They were like, hey, maybe there's a better way to deal with crime, something more humane, more focused on rehabilitation.
It's like society started to develop a conscience, realizing that maybe all that blood and guts wasn't the best way to deal with criminals.
Mm-hmm.
So they dreamed up the prison as a more civilized solution.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm guessing Foucault has some thoughts on that, right?
Oh, absolutely. He argues that this shift wasn't really about being nice to criminals. It was about finding a more efficient and subtle way to control them. The prison for Foucault is like this machine designed to produce docile bodies, obedient citizens who follow the rules and contribute to society.
So it's like, even though the methods change, the underlying goal was still the same
Mm-hmm.
control.
Exactly. And he points out how this shift in punishment mirrored a broader change in how power operates in society. Power was becoming less about brute force and more about discipline, surveillance, and shaping individuals from the inside out.
So how does Foucault see this idea of discipline playing out in the prison?
Well, he describes the prison as a place where every aspect of life is regulated and controlled. Think about the strict schedules, the constant surveillance, the emphasis on obedience and conformity. It's all about breaking down the individual's will and molding them into this ideal obedient subject. He even uses this phrase, the soul is the prison of the body, which is pretty intense.
Yeah, it's like they're trying to control not just your actions, but your very thoughts and feelings.
Right. And he points out how the prison actually creates a new kind of person, the delinquent. It's not just about punishing someone for a specific crime. It's about classifying them, labeling them as a criminal type, which makes it harder for them to reintegrate into society.
So it's like the prison system itself is actually contributing to the problem of crime.
That's exactly what Foucault argues.
Wow.
He calls this the carceral archipelago, this sprawling network of institutions from the police to the courts to the prisons that all work together to control and categorize people.
Whoa, that carceral archipelago thing is heavy. I'm starting to see how these ideas can really challenge the way we think about crime and punishment.
Yeah. Well, honestly, it's a bit unsettling to think about how much control we surrender without even realizing it. Like all those seemingly mundane things like school bells and time clocks suddenly seem a lot more sinister.
Right. It's like Foucault is giving us this new lens through which to see the world, and suddenly everything looks different.
Yeah, it's definitely making me think twice about all those times I've felt pressured to conform or behave in a certain way. But I also have to admit, it's fascinating.
It's like peeling back the layers of society and seeing the hidden mechanisms of power at work.
Exactly. And that's what makes Foucault so brilliant. He's not just critiquing the prison system, he's challenging us to think critically about power itself,
Right.
about how it operates in all aspects of our lives.
So where do we go from here? What else does Foucault explore in this deep dive into the world of discipline and punishment?
Well, now that we've laid the groundwork, we can really start digging into the meat of his argument. He goes on to explore this concept of the panopticon, this architectural design that embodies the idea of constant surveillance and control. And he shows how this panoptic principle extends far beyond the prison, influencing everything from schools and hospitals to the way we interact with technology today.
Okay, now that sounds creepy.
Yeah.
The panopticon, I need to hear more about this.
All right, let's talk about the panopticon. Picture this. A circular prison with cells arranged around a central watchtower. The guards in the tower can see into every cell, but the prisoners can't see the guards.
So prisoners never know if they're actually being watched,
Right.
but they always feel like they are.
Exactly. It's like this constant invisible pressure
Right.
making them police their own behavior. It's way more subtle and insidious than chains or bars.
I could see how that would be way more effective in the long run.
Yeah.
If you always think someone might be watching,
Yeah.
you're less likely to step out of line even if no one is actually there. But wait,
Yeah.
wasn't the panopticon just a design?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, did they actually build prisons like that?
Well, yes and no. Some prisons did incorporate elements of the panopticon design.
Okay.
But Foucault's point is bigger than that. He sees the panopticon as a metaphor for how power works in modern society.
A metaphor. So he's saying we're all living in a giant panopticon.
In a way, yes. Think about all the surveillance cameras on street corners,
Right.
the data our phones collect, the way our online activity is tracked. It's like we're constantly being watched and judged, even if we don't always realize it.
Okay. That's pretty creepy when you put it like that.
Uh-huh.
But I have to admit, it's kind of brilliant, too. I mean, it's a
Right.
really effective way to control people, right?
Yeah, it is, and that's exactly what makes it so unsettling. Foucault is challenging us to think about the trade-offs we make for security and order.
Right.
Are we willing to sacrifice some of our privacy and freedom in exchange for feeling safe and controlled?
It's like a deal with the devil, isn't it? You get the illusion of safety, but at what cost?
Yeah.
But Foucault isn't just talking about prisons and surveillance cameras, right?
No,
He sees this disciplinary power at work in other areas of life, too, doesn't he?
absolutely. He argues that schools, hospitals, factories, they all use similar techniques to shape individuals into docile and productive members of society.
Okay.
Think about how schools use bells, strict schedules, and exams to control children, or how factories use time clocks and assembly lines to regulate workers. It's all part of this larger system of discipline that Foucault is trying to expose.
So we're basically being trained from a young age to be obedient and follow the rules without even questioning why.
That's one way to look at it. Foucault would say that these systems aren't inherently evil or malicious.
Right.
They're often presented as ways to improve efficiency, productivity, or even our well-being. But his point is that we need to be aware of how these systems can be used to control and limit our freedom, even if it's done with the best of intentions.
It's like that saying, the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Uh,
I'm starting to see why this book is considered such a classic. It's really making me think about the world in a whole new way.
And we're just getting started. There's another really important concept that Foucault explores: the gentle way of punishment. Remember how we talked about the shift from public torture to the prison?
Okay, this sounds interesting. I remember you mentioning this earlier. So the reformers who pushed for prisons, they were all about being more humane, right?
Mm-hmm.
What's so insidious about that?
Well, Foucault points out that even though they abandoned those brutal public executions,
Right.
the reformers were still obsessed with controlling and manipulating the criminal. It was less about punishment and more about molding them into the ideal citizen.
So it's like instead of whipping them into shape, they were trying to reprogram their minds.
Exactly. They were all about surveillance discipline and psychological manipulation. It was this idea that you could reform a criminal by controlling their thoughts and behaviors, even if it meant using methods that weren't so gentle after all.
I'm getting some serious Clockwork Orange vibes here. It's like that scene where they strap Alex to the chair and force him to watch those violent films trying to rewire his brain.
That's a great analogy. Foucault would argue that this gentle way of punishment is all about getting inside your head,
Yeah.
reshaping your desires and motivations, even if it means using coercion or manipulation.
So even though they were trying to be more humane, they ended up creating a system that was arguably even more intrusive and controlling?
That's the paradox that Foucault highlights. And he shows how this gentle way of punishment extends far beyond the prison.
Right.
It's present in the way we educate children, treat the mentally ill, and even how we interact with each other in everyday life.
It's like this invisible hand guiding our behavior,
Yeah.
shaping our thoughts, making us conform without us even realizing it.
Exactly. And Foucault argues that we need to be aware of these subtle forms of control if we want to resist them and create a more just and equitable society.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
But okay, here's a question that's been bugging me.
Yeah.
If the prison system is so flawed, if it actually contributes to the problem of crime, why do we still rely on it so heavily? Haven't we come up with any better alternatives?
That's the million-dollar question. And Foucault doesn't offer any easy answers.
Okay.
He suggests that the prison persists not because it's effective, but because it serves a deeper function within the power dynamics of society.
Right.
It's a way to manage and control certain segments of the population, particularly those who are seen as dangerous or undesirable.
So it's like a way to keep the undesirables out of sight and out of mind. But that's pretty messed up, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, it's basically saying that we're okay with sacrificing entire groups of people just to maintain the illusion of order and safety.
It is a pretty bleak picture, but Foucault forces us to confront the uncomfortable realities of how power operates. He's not saying that we should just abolish prisons overnight, but he is challenging us to think critically about why we punish, who we punish, and what we hope to achieve through punishment.
It's like he's saying, don't just accept things the way they are. Question the assumptions, challenge the system, and imagine a world where we do things differently.
And one of the ways he challenges us is by highlighting those who resisted the system, even in the most oppressive circumstances. Remember that term counterfeit divers?
Ooh, yeah, remind me about that. I'm a little fuzzy on the details.
So back in 19th century France, there were these working class newspapers that would take crime stories from the mainstream press and reframe them.
Okay.
They'd highlight the social and economic factors that contributed to the crime, focusing on the plight of the poor and marginalized. It was like they were saying, hey, these people aren't just criminals, they're victims of a system that's rigged against them.
That's amazing. It's like they were giving a voice to the voiceless, exposing the hypocrisy of the system.
Exactly. And it shows that even within a system of control and punishment, there is always the potential for resistance.
Right.
For challenging the dominant narrative. It's a glimmer of hope in what can often feel like a very bleak landscape.
I love that. It's like even in the darkest corners, there are always those who fight back, who refuse to be silenced.
And Foucault's work reminds us that we all have that power to question, to challenge, to resist.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about public torture, the rise of the prison, the panopticon, the gentle way of punishment, the carceral archipelago, and the counterfeit divers.
Yeah.
My head is spinning, but I feel like I'm starting to see the world through Foucault's eyes, and it's both fascinating and unsettling.
Right. He's like this intellectual earthquake shaking up our assumptions and making us rethink everything we thought we knew about power, punishment, and the very nature of society itself.
So where do we go from here? How do we wrap all of this up?
Well, one thing that's really central to his argument is this idea of the examination.
Oh, yeah. He has this whole section in the book where he talks about examinations
Yeah.
as like this key part of disciplinary power.
Right.
Right. I remember thinking it was kind of a weird topic to focus on at first. But the more we talk about this stuff,
Right.
the more I'm like, okay, maybe he's onto something here.
Yeah, you might think of exams as just a way to test knowledge, right?
Right.
But Foucault sees them as a much more powerful tool of control.
Okay, I'm listening.
It's not just about what you know. It's about putting you under a microscope, making you the object of scrutiny and judgment. It forces you to internalize the gaze authority, to constantly evaluate yourself according to their standards.
It's like that feeling of being watched that we were
Yeah.
talking about earlier, but even more intense because now you're being actively judged and evaluated.
Right.
I see how this connects back to the panopticon idea. It's all about creating this sense of self-consciousness, this pressure to conform.
Exactly. And Foucault points out how the examination is used in all sorts of institutions, not just schools.
Right.
Think about job interviews,
Oh.
medical checkups, Psychological evaluations.
Uh-huh.
They're all ways of assessing and categorizing individuals, making them fit into predefined boxes.
It's like society is constantly trying to measure us, quantify it, put us
Yeah.
in our place, and we internalize those judgments,
Yeah.
those categories, until they become part of how we see ourselves.
That's the really insidious part.
Hmm.
This disciplinary power isn't just imposed on us from the outside.
Right.
It seeps into our very being, shaping our thoughts, our desires, our sense of self. It's like we become complicit in our own control.
Okay, that is seriously mind-blowing.
Yeah.
So if we're all caught up in this web of disciplinary power, is there any way to escape it? Is Foucault just leaving us with this bleak, deterministic view of the world?
Well, Foucault wasn't about offering easy answers or simplistic solutions,
Right.
but he did believe in the power of resistance, of challenging the norms and structures that seek to define and control us.
So how do we resist something that's so deeply embedded in our society?
Mhm.
Something that's often invisible even to ourselves?
It starts with awareness, with seeing the world through Foucault's eyes, recognizing the subtle ways in which power operates in our everyday lives. Once we see those hidden mechanisms, we can start to question them,
Oh.
challenge them, and maybe even find ways to subvert them.
So it's not about overthrowing the system. It's
Mm.
about finding cracks in the foundation, little spaces where we can reclaim our freedom and autonomy.
Exactly. And it's about remembering that we're not just docile bodies passively accepting the dictates of power. We're human beings with agency,
Mm.
with the capacity to think critically,
Right.
to make choices, to resist.
It's like Foucault is giving us a toolkit for understanding and challenging the power structures that shape our world.
Mm.
He's not telling us what to do, but he's giving us the tools to figure it out for ourselves.
And that's what makes his work so relevant even today, decades after it was written. We're still grappling with the same issues of power,
Right?
control, surveillance, and the struggle for individual freedom.
Wow, this deep dive has been quite a journey. We started with public torture and ended up questioning the very foundations of our society. I feel like my brain has been stretched in all sorts of new and interesting ways.
Me too. Foucault is definitely one of those thinkers who stays with you long after you've finished reading him.
So, dear listener, as you go about your day, as you navigate the institutions and structures of your life, remember Foucault's words. Question the assumptions, challenge the norms, and don't be afraid to resist the subtle forms of control that seek to shape your life.
Remember, knowledge is power. And by understanding how power operates, we can begin to reclaim our own agency to create a more just and equitable world.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into discipline and punish. Until next time, keep those thinking caps on, and we'll see you in the next deep dive.